So I don't know if that helps, but
yeah, no, that's good. So I think your viewpoint is slightly different from Jackson's. In my language, I'd say, Jaxon, yours is slightly more liberal. But I'll ask you the next question. I'll set that one up, and then afterwards I'll respond to all of your comments. So okay, so you've answered, the perspective of someone praying to know if the Book of Mormon is true and receiving the answer that it's not. Now, the challenge here is that Mormonism isn't the only religion, obviously, that exists, but also not the only one that uses this framework of the divine witness. And there are many other religions that either explicitly or implicitly use a similar framework. By explicitly, it means they also say you can pray to know that our religion is true. And implicitly, it means that even though they don't say you can pray to know it's true, in any case, still their adherents do exactly that and receive answers. So I just wanted to ask the two of you, there are a couple of these, but there's a particular video on YouTube that has a compilation of people having religious experiences in connection with their faith. It's by a channel called Ask Reality. Mm-hmm. It's titled 8.0 My LDS Journey. It's linked to in the CES letter.
Mm-hmm. I've seen that.
Have you both seen it?
Mm-hmm.
I haven't taken the time to watch it, but I'm familiar with this line of argumentation. Yeah, and sure. I've thought about it myself, for sure. And I talked to enough people to where I've witnessed it firsthand, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, the summary is there's a compilation. There are multiple compilations online, and they're really beautiful, actually, where they have different people from different religions just sharing their, in our language, testimonies, just saying what they believe and why. And it turns out that the experience of having a divine feeling of sorts, or what people interpret to be a divine feeling, is actually quite common in multiple religions. And so actually, I mean, in terms of objectively verifiable data, right, again, I can't tell you whether or not these people are lying, but I assume they're not. I assume they're just being sincere like we are. But in terms of objectively verifiable data, the data suggests that people pray to know if their own religion is true, most often, pray to know if the religion that they were either born into or are currently encountering, say whether that be the Jehovah's Witnesses or Mormons, and they have a variety of experiences all over the scale that confirm to them that their religion is true. One example, when I was doing my intense research period in 2015, I read a Jehovah's Witness Watchtower. And there was really, I mean, it's a very simple example, but I've definitely heard ones like this in testimony meeting. A girl is investigating the Jehovah's Witness faith, and she's driving in her car one day, and she's praying to know which church is true, what God's true name is, because the Jehovah's Witnesses really obsess about that question. And just as she's praying, she drives past the Kingdom Hall, and she has this enlightening experience. There's the answer. Just as I was praying, I drove past the Kingdom Hall, and there's the answer that God's name is Jehovah, and she had this wonderful experience, and now she's a Jehovah's Witness. And when I did my intense research, I researched all sorts of conversion experiences to and from all sorts of faiths. So, in fact, if you go to YouTube and you type in Mormon converts to Islam, you'll find testimonies.
Yeah.
And you Google Muslim converts to Mormonism, you'll find testimonies. And you Google atheist converts to Christian, you'll find testimonies. And you go Christian converts to atheism, you'll find testimonies. Any combination of any faith to any faith. In fact, I actually created a spreadsheet when I was researching. And this to this to this, and I put YouTube videos of people who were having this experience, right? Who were converting from X to Y and hearing their stories. And religious experiences are very, very typical in religious conversions. That's why they're so incredible. And so that leads me, and I'll add one extra data point to this before asking for your response. The British illusionist Darren Brown actually has a presentation of sort of one of his episodes of his show where it's entitled How to Convert an Atheist. And Darren Brown is an atheist, and he gathers a bunch of atheists and he vets them, and he finds this stem cell researcher girl who's very skeptical, very much an atheist. And through psychological techniques, through the power of suggestion, he sort of suggests certain things to her. For example, like her life has an ultimate purpose. Someone's watching out for her, giving her meaning. He creates the image of a perfect father in her mind. So, and based on her, muse at that point in time, he brings her into a Catholic church, and he gets her into the state where she's sort of receptive to these ideas. And then he just walks away, and he suggests that if she stands up, everything will come together. And because she's subconsciously processing these things, when she stands up, she has a powerful religious experience, and she breaks down in tears, and she cries, she bawls her eyes out. And it's really beautiful, actually. And after that, she comes back to the show a week later, and she says, I'm questioning whether or not there's a God. Like, this experience has led to cognitive dissonance for me. I'm not sure, because I used to be so certain there wasn't a God before. But now that I had this experience, I really think there might be. In fact, her initial reaction is to pray, her immediate reaction when she had this experience. And so from these different data points, I guess I'm not asking for validation. I'm fully within my own integrity to have the conclusions I have. But can you see how someone can look at all of these data points and say, it seems that people are praying to know if their own church is true. It seems that religious experiences can be induced, and based on the objective evidence, the reasoning and apologetics behind there being a gold-plated book that Joseph Smith translated is almost as good as the reasoning that Muhammad flew on a winged horse back to heaven. And so you look at the kind of apologetics from various religions and their use of reason and logic and evidence. And then you look at the other side, the spiritual witnesses, and in essence, it doesn't look like anything has a firm foundation. Again, that's my final conclusion. Yeah. But how do the two of you respond to that? The data does show that people pray to know if their own church is true. Most often, people are not, it's not like they randomly pick another church and pray to know if that church is true. And it's not like they go through 2 or 3 years of investigation into Islam, and then another 2 or 3 years into Hinduism, and then another 2 or 3 years into Jehovah's Witnesses. They give a lot of leeway, a lot of slack to a single religion, most often the one they were born into. And they spend a lot of time investigating their own religion, seeing if it's true, praying about that religion only, and often seem to have religious experiences confirming that religion is true. How do you respond to those? How do you resolve those?
Well, if I might talk first, I think, Shawn, you just described a lot of what I've experienced, and I'm just going to validate that, right? Because, being born into a faith, right? I think if we're going to explain my experience in purely naturalistic terms, right? I could totally see someone looking at an individual like myself. I'm born in a certain family. I'm conditioned from a very early age with certain preconceptions and a certain worldview, right? That makes me later on, when I'm trying to determine whether or not that worldview is valid, just makes me more conditioned to accept it, right? Just given, that's what I'm familiar with. Then going through years of faith crisis, that is the one that I spent the most time looking into. I've studied all different religions, but the one that I've studied the most is Mormonism, right? And the one that I've, spiritually wrestled with the most is Mormonism. And, I'll also say that there's situations that, come up both in the Mormon church and both in other churches and religions as well, that can condition or set up environments for individuals to feel, certain things, whether you're going to a Christian praise session, where it's like, okay, if you feel so inclined, raise your hands up and you'll be saved, right? And then a bunch of people do that and they're saved, and 70 souls come to Christ, right? And there's music and there's lights and there's fog. Or in the Mormon temple, a very quiet spiritual place that, is kind of talked about quite a bit, and given a level of reverence within the faith and within the community. People have profound spiritual experiences there as well. And so, I want to validate what you're saying, and I totally understand why that appears problematic to individuals. Personally, the way I see it and the way that I've wrestled with this is when it comes to these, when it comes to this discussion that we're having, I think we're dealing, one of the questions we're touching on is when an individual has an experience, does that experience of itself confirm the exclusive truth claim that they have in mind, right? Because I'm open to the possibility that the two might not be, even though, you know, they happen in a similar time, they might not be correlated at all, or, you know, it might not be causal, right? Just because you feel a certain way. What if what you're feeling is testifying of something completely different, right? And so the way I see it, and the way that I've resolved this is just that I believe, and I think humans are conditioned and just naturally spiritual beings, kind of like what Leo described. All of us, we have this capacity to experience the unknown, the other, the spiritual, the metaphysical, right? And so as we grapple with what this means, right, we like to attach answers to it and try and say what it means or what it must mean. And so for me, I think I believe that process does testify of truth, but I don't look at it as a complete black and white dichotomy. Rather, I look at it as more of a spectrum, if that makes sense. Because, you know, one objection that I've heard, you know, is people say, well, you know, I read the Book of Mormon. I got the same feelings, you know, reading that as I did when I watched Braveheart or, you know, a movie like that, you know, and they start talking about feelings because these come down to feelings. Well, I would separate the two into different categories of the intensity of feelings, but, you know, definitely we're dealing with subjective experiences. And so for me, it just testifies of truth. It testifies of true principles, of manners and kind of ways that I think raise human beings up to a higher level of morality. As to the exclusive truth claims, I think we need to throw some actual objective evidence in there as well and kind of weigh those arguments to really get like a more balanced approach to that. Sometimes, like I mentioned earlier, we're dealing with topics that we just can't prove through evidence one way or the other. They're just outside of our capacity to do so at the moment. And so whether or not an individual chooses to believe that, you know, that's up to them. But, you know, for me, that's just kind of the approach I take with it. So I validate people's experiences. I believe that, you know, it sets them on the journey that they're supposed to be on. And it's meant to teach them things that they need to be taught. And it can teach them principles and symbols in which they can view the universe. And so for me, what I've experienced is, you know, one that has led me into Mormonism. And so, you know, as I'm about to enter the mission field, because, you know, this will be kind of interesting, you know, being a missionary with, you know, perhaps a slightly different perspective than other Mormons. You know, I'm just going to invite other people to, you know, have the same experiences or leave the possibility open and reach their own conclusions. And, you know, that's just kind of how I see it.
All right. No, that's a good response. Yeah. Good response. It's honest. I just try and stay away from the black and white dichotomy that's set up. Like either it's true or it's false, and that's just the leaders of the LDS Church don't stay away from that dichotomy. You know that.
I think I've found a space that I'm comfortable with within Mormonism to where I can look to different quotes and teachings from different leaders that I would say also justifies, you know, my argument. I can, you know, definitely find the black and white as well, but that's just where I'm at.
I actually have an article on one of my blogs called "The Gospels Dance with Dichotomy," and I investigate exactly that question, which is the sort of dichotomous thinking is featured, as you mentioned, in some leaders, but not in others. Jeffrey R. Holland has a sort of sudden death approach to the Book of Mormon, which is highly dichotomous. In any case, that's good. Thank you. Very, very honest answer. My response, just briefly, firstly, our view, whatever our worldview is, it is all-encompassing. It has to explain everything. And so I'll use a quick illustration. One of the things that apologists often draw attention to is that Joseph Smith produced the Book of Mormon in a very short amount of time. Mm-hmm. And that is one data point that we have to consider. We have to explain that somehow. But when I look at other religions and when I look at other religious leaders, there are others who also wrote very quickly. For instance, L. Ron Hubbard of Scientology was a prolific writer. And he
like one of the most prolific too, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, I think he won the Guinness World Record for most number of books written, kind of thing. So when I study Joseph Smith, I don't study him in isolation as one person, but I study the Hubbard or Sun Moon or Jesus Christ or, all Muhammad, these different, I take them as different data points. And so what my worldview must do is explain all of them somehow, all of their experiences, all of their religious experiences, everything. Of course, my conclusion is the most simple of all. I think it's the Occam's razor of that analysis. But I'm also reminded of, you were talking about this spiritual feeling, and something that Mormons sometimes say is when a Muslim feels the Holy Ghost, it's just God telling them that their religion has true principles, or that it's a generally good place to be, or it's a generally good religion, etc. And one of the challenges then is that it becomes a debate of my feelings versus your feelings. And my feelings mean that Mormonism is the one and only true religion, but your feelings mean that Islam is just a good place. So the question comes, how come that's not reversed? How come their feelings don't mean Islam is the one and only true religion, whichever branch of it they're in? And mine aren't just God telling me that Mormonism is just a good place with true principles. So that's a challenge, and that comes down to the philosophy of solipsism, which is that we don't know how other people actually feel. We just know how we feel. I don't know if the two of you are conscious, but it's very egocentric to presume that other people's feelings aren't just as valid as our own. And so generally speaking, I mean, my explanation here is, as I analyzed the data, as I looked at people transitioning, I had to come up with a worldview that explained that coherently. Why is everyone receiving revelation about their own church being true? And I like what Leo said here. Leo, you're a bit more straightforward with this response. You're just saying, is he a God of truth? Does he tell people what's true? And from my perspective, that simple, is it true, is the way that I approach the question. Now, I'm not actually invalidating, Jaxon, I like your approach. I like that. I actually like that liberal feeling. I'm going to speak straightforward. I think people like you represent the positive direction that Mormonism is going in, actually. But overall, that's not the same conclusion I came to. Just finally, I'm all good with spirituality, generally. In fact, I care a lot about spirituality. That's an entire other discussion. But my conclusion from the data is that feelings are not a solid basis to establish reality. There's actually a book written by Sam Harris, famous atheist, called Waking Up, A Guide to Spirituality Without Religion. And he has a quote.
That's a good book. I should have.
Yes. Have you read it?
Yes, I have.
Oh, yeah. So it's a good, interesting book. And he has a quote. I don't know if this is in the book, but it's definitely on his blog. And he says, as a general matter, I believe we should be very slow to draw conclusions about the nature of the cosmos on the basis of inner experiences, no matter how profound they may seem. So I definitely agree that religious experiences are a very, very important topic. They are central to the Mormon experience. It's a key part of Mormon theology. And that's why I created my podcast to explore them and to talk about, what do Buddhists refer to as the sense of self? And when you lose that, how does that feel? What kind of experience is that? What's the effect of things like psychedelic drugs? What are other things that could explain some of the feelings, the secular-based models that could explain the feelings that people have religiously? And so I've investigated this topic at great length. But I like that, again, I think, Jaxon, there's a good segue to the next topic, which is you've said that there is an importance of objectively verifiable evidence, because my conclusion is that feelings are unreliable. And I think that your honest response is, at best, there are some challenges, right, with feeling-based theology. And I don't know, is that sort of what you're saying? Like, you're okay to say that there are some challenges?
Yeah, I would say there's some challenges, and I would say I would even go so far as to say people shouldn't rely completely upon subjective feelings to establish reality for the same challenges.
Cool. So I think we've had a good discussion so far, and we've covered a lot of important topics. I appreciate the responses that you've both given. I think they're honest, and they're reflective of your viewpoint, and they're well considered. So let's keep going. The next section is about the Book of Mormon and the Book of Abraham. Now, I think that both of you are probably quite familiar with the most generic criticisms of the texts. For those who might be in the audience who are not familiar, we're not actually going to go into very deep detail, because we know that this could go on literally forever. If you go look at LDS Apologetics, you could take I have one line here, and there will be books on the subject. So let's just, if you can you give sort of quick bullet point responses to some of the ways that you resolve, in your minds, these challenges to the Book of Mormon as an ancient record? So, for example, let's just get straight to it. So, the Book of Mormon, let's start with the King James Version translation errors that are present in the text. What are your straightforward sort of bullet point responses to this criticism?
Leo, what do you think?
So Jackson's the scholar here, but the studies that I've done on kind of how we received the Book of Mormon, and there isn't any evidence that Joseph was using a Bible. No one there's a lot of people that wrote about and talked about him and how he translated the Book of Mormon, but they never mentioned him opening up a Bible and using that but the actual process of the original manuscript, we have a part of that, 25% or so, and then we have almost the entire printer's manuscript, and then we have, of course, the Book of Mormon, the first version, and then the other versions, right? But we don't really know, if Joseph was able to use a Bible or not, and I think from the historical record, right, we don't know for sure, and so just the honest answer is we don't know. And obviously he is either receiving that language. If that's your viewpoint, that's great, but I think personally he could have had referenced the Bible and clarifying, because the argument is they're tired. These two guys, they're working like 6 to 8 hours a day translating for these 3 months, Oliver and Joseph, right? And it's not going to be fun work, just sitting there talking for 6 hours straight. It's tiring. And so I'm sure that he got to the point when he saw introduction, hey, Isaiah's coming up, great, let's just pull up the Bible and let's copy it over, right? That makes sense to me. If I was doing it, I would say that's probably an easier way, and say, let's look at the Bible, reference the Bible, make sure that, because Joseph, I think this is my testimony, man. Joseph was a farmer. He was outside. Of course, he was looking for treasure, right? We know that. But he was outside. He was like collecting sap in the forest and like building houses chopping down wood and like looking for work. The kid wasn't in school. He wasn't in school. Like, his parents they were whatever, school teachers, fine. But the family had to survive on the frontier. And so Joseph, he had to figure it out, man. And he could barely write. He was just not smart. He ended up becoming pretty intelligent over time. I feel like he was tutored by God and by other good people, and he had a drive to learn. But initially, man, he didn't have it. And so I feel like Joseph he understood his total depravity. He really did. And I think he went and got as much help as he could. Even if he used the Bible, we don't know. But that's my opinion. Jackson, the scholar, fix everything I just said.
I'm no scholar yet, but I will say that when it comes to Isaiah, some of the issues present and Shawn, I assume you've looked into this too. It's much more than just whether or not he lifted text from Isaiah and put it into the Book of Mormon. I mean, that's pretty obvious that there's Isaiah text, because Nephi, he says he's quoting Isaiah, and so there's no attempt to hide that fact by any means. With kind of higher criticism of the Bible itself, breaking down Isaiah, right? We have Isaiah, there's Proto-Isaiah, there's Trito-Isaiah, there's Deutero-Isaiah, right? There's a lot of scholarship showing that the book that we refer to as Isaiah likely or had the potential of being written by multiple authors over time, and over course of many years. And so when you interlay this with what the Book of Mormon claims with the chronology, as far as Nephi's family leaves at a certain date around 600 BC. Higher criticism of the Bible would suggest that, well, by the time they left, the parts of Isaiah that are in the Book of Mormon shouldn't be there, and that they're anachronistic in that sense. And so, there's definitely that to consider. There's debate, from biblical scholars on whether or not Isaiah was composed by multiple authors. So I wouldn't say that's completely definitive. I'd say there's a consensus that that's likely the case. And as far as Latter-day Saints go about approaching the subject, they answer it in different ways based off the criticism, based off the scholarship they're dealing with from biblical studies. And so there's just, like I said, this is a subject that we could really dive into. But I'm under the impression that in portions where Nephi is quoting Isaiah, that it's likely, given Joseph's own religious environment, that he could have either put the text in there himself in kind of a pseudepigrapha, if we want to call it that, or that Nephi, if we assume that he's a historical character, who knows, he very well could have had the actual Isaiah portions and put those in there. Like Leo said, there's just not consensus in a lot of different areas, and so it just adds complexity to this issue. But I will recognize that and validate that this is kind of an area that Latter-day Saints need to attempt to explain. Okay. It's not seamless, and so for me, I look at the narrative and the way that Second Nephi utilizes Isaiah, and I think it's very artistic. It's very cohesive and coherent, and so for me, that shows it shows me that it's not just planted in there without any thought. It's there under thoughtful consideration. Whether that's thoughts from Joseph or Nephi is up for debate. But I think it's quite interesting that that text is utilized.
Yeah. Okay. Good. No. I'll briefly respond to that, and then we'll move on. So, as for beauty, it's interesting. I recently read a book about Islam, the Quran, and certain arguments, basically in defense of the Quran as a sacred text. And one of the interesting arguments is an appeal to beauty, which is that the Arabic that the Quran was written in is so transcendently beautiful that a human couldn't have written it. It had to be divinely inspired. That's the only way it could be. So I guess, again, I'm just referring to the difficulty of using beauty as an argument.
Yeah, and don't mistake me. I wasn't making that my main argument either.
Yeah, sure. To the Joseph Smith's mind thing, we could talk about this all day, but I think he was a very intelligent person, just not a very educated person. And I think that shines through in a lot of his work, actually. And so I don't think he needed to plagiarize the King James Version in the way that people are implying. This is one of the things about the criticisms or weaknesses with criticisms is criticisms are trying to break down the classical LDS narrative. They're not trying to establish what the actual response is. So if it wasn't divinely inspired, then what is it? And that's one of the challenges. The criticism don't piece together the puzzle of what it is. Now, obviously, I think I have a puzzle that's pieced together about what it is. I think Joseph Smith did think what he was translating is the Book of Mormon, just like I think L. Ron Hubbard thought Dianetics was an amazing book, and Muhammad thought that what he was writing was divinely inspired. And I think that each of these characters sincerely believed what they were doing was inspired. If he has the mind that I think he has, he wouldn't have to plagiarize the book. There's actually a really great TED Talk called Embrace the Remix, I think, which speaks about how the creative process works in the human mind. And it gives examples of musicians who put together music that they thought was novel, but then it can actually be traced back to other pieces of music that were in their environment that they would have heard but would have forgotten where they got it from. And so, yeah. And so my worldview on Joseph Smith is not that he fraudulently wrote a book, not that he's like, hey guys, let's get together, let's create a religion, make lots of money. I mean, at least L. Ron Hubbard said that explicitly, but I don't think there's any evidence of Joseph Smith saying that, those exact words. But what I think he wrote what he thought was the word of God. But I think what was actually happening was the creative processes of the mind mixed together with a highly religious / superstitious worldview. So that's how I explain how the King James heirs get in there, because he was reading the Bible a lot and he was very, very religious. And so what I think happened was this thing came to him. Now, again, it's about the data points. I'm not just trying to explain Joseph Smith. I have a worldview that has to explain everyone. So I have to explain, I don't know if you know A.J. Muller, but he's a character up in Queensland here in Australia. He's a new messiah figure, right? And he's also a prolific content creator. He has a YouTube channel you can go look up called The Divine Truth. He puts out an extensive amount of content. He's extremely creative. He has his own new flavor or version of Christianity. He claims to be the reincarnated Jesus. He claims his girlfriend is the reincarnated Mary, etc. And the point is that he sincerely believes everything he is saying, and it's also highly creative, highly imaginative. So I guess we could go into each of the other topics. I just wanted to mention DNA evidence. I guess we should just do a shout out that at least the LDS Church has put an article up on LDS.org that's about this exact subject. Mm-hmm. There's archaeological evidence. There's anachronisms. And again, apologists, if you go look at Fair Mormon, they'll actually analyze each one individually, and they'll give discussions about each anachronism individually. There are similar books existing in the same time period, and the presence of 19th century Protestant material in the Book of Mormon. Now, I think what we could do on each of these points is actually go back and forth extensively, and that would take a long, long time. But I guess my summary from my side is that these things speak to me to say that they sort of validate the idea. Anachronisms is a great idea. There's this Nahum thing that apologists really like, which is that there's this location along the route that Lehi should have taken that matches Nahum, right? And they use the term Joseph Smith wouldn't have known that as an argument in support of the authenticity of the Book of Mormon. Similarly, that can be used to say Joseph Smith wouldn't have known there were no horses or cattle or oxen or sheep or swine, etc., elephants. And so what I think the situation that comes is the honest seeker of truth has to analyze all of these at length if they're really serious about Mormonism. And it's sort of like a detective case. You weigh up the evidence on both sides, you analyze it extensively and the ways arguments are made, and come to conclusions. Now, again, if you want to, how about this? To save time, we won't go into every one, but you're welcome to pick up any one of those that you have some comments you want to make on. So there's DNA challenges, archaeological challenges, anachronisms, the thematic, similar books with large thematic overlap, and presence of 19th century Protestant material. Again, I'm not saying that there are no apologetic responses to these. In fact, probably most of anything I say is going to be echoing some other critic who said something first. Most of what you say is going to be echoing some apologist who said something first. But is there anything you want to draw attention to?
I'll just want to mention a couple of things. Just so Nibley was famous in saying the Book of Mormon was a colossal structure, right? I don't know if you've heard that before, but That man was brilliant. You can't argue against him. Like he's very, very smart man, and he all of his research into the Book of Mormon, the history there, and his statement of it being a colossal structure. Given the fact that Joseph was dictating the Book of Mormon, I mean, Skousen's work, Royal Skousen, which we can provide a link to his work in the description, but for him to, I understand what you're saying there, Shawn. I want to validate that perspective, your worldview, and all that. It's important, but I don't know, man. Like the word print analysis that they've done, showing it's about 24 authors, and for a young man in his early 20s to sit down and just spout that off with the Hebrewisms that are in there, like Alma 36, the chiasmus is I mean, like for him to come up with, I mean, yes, like maybe like a 5 or 6 line chiasmus, sure, because he wrote in small chiasmus before, in other like letters to people and stuff. I saw that, but I mean, for him to just out of nowhere come up with some of that in the I guess it's if and conditional statements that are from ancient Hebrew that are in there, and like him just to come up with that, and to him to switch between the ancient language that's in there and then his modern language and all the different authors. It's like he'd have to be the savant. I call him the savant of all savants. For him to be able to memorize some kind of text before he went to bed night prior, every single night, and then get up hour after hour, dictate that, is just, it's alien. To be honest,
yeah,
I cannot fathom that being able to be reproduced by any person that's ever lived on the earth in that kind of manner. I mean, if it's all a hoax and Joseph didn't dictate it, then the history disagrees, because Skousen's work showing that dictation happened. There's evidence for that, strong evidence for that. And so, I mean, I know that what you're saying is he was intelligent. He was, but was he smart enough to create the colossal structure of the Book of Mormon? My skeptic mind says no. I just can't see it happening. I don't know. I don't know enough, maybe, but go ahead.
No, I think just briefly, I think Richard Bushman has a very honest statement in regards to that argument, where he says either it was a divine work or it was the work of a genius, in the sense that it's beyond our ordinary human, a very, very, very intelligent person.
Yeah, he was.
I agree with the honesty in that statement. Of course, again, we have to explain all the data points. So Joseph Smith and the Book of Mormon is not, it's unique, yes, but there are other prophetic figures who have also created a lot of content in various forms. Muhammad, for example, I'm talking about some.
We're talking about dictation and kind of oral, writing down of scriptures, right? That Muhammad is another individual that, in this respect, can be compared to Joseph Smith. I mean, different than let's say L. Ron Hubbard or different writers who are actually writing, and the text themselves. These are all oral renditions of these scriptures. So in that respect, they are unique and comparable.
Yeah, no, that's good. So okay. That's good. Do you want to add anything else, or I'm just looking at time? Maybe we can. I'll cherry pick some of the final questions. I don't think we have time to go through everything, but
do you mind if I?
Yeah, go ahead.
Just throw in my 2 cents for the last one.
Absolutely.
I definitely recognize anachronisms. In fact, for me, the presence of anachronisms, I wouldn't say is completely. It doesn't show completely to me that it's either true or false, because the Bible has anachronisms. Like when we're talking about just renditions of history, right? You look at Herodotus. There's plenty of anachronisms in his writings, right? It's just kind of part of when we're judging a historical record, for there to be anachronisms in, and there's different ways that LDS scholars and academics approach this issue. As far as the translation process, there's tight translation where Joseph is translating kind of word for word what is on the supposed gold plates. There's a loose translation where he's more of thinking and processing of the text as it's coming to his mind as he's receiving this revelation, and then putting it into language that he's familiar with, right? And so there's various ways that Latter-day Saints themselves make sense of these data points, and so I want to point that out. And then just finally speaking to this, for me, when we're talking about something that claims to be a record of history, this is coming from the early 19th century, and so it's had a considerable, or it's had a fair amount of time to kind of be given evidence for or against. And something that's just amazing to me and just speaks to me personally is the amount of arguments and evidence that Latter-day Saint scholars have been able to put out there in support of a historical Book of Mormon. For me, there's just volumes upon volumes, and I'm not saying that this validates the Book of Mormon of itself, but just the fact that rather than seeing the Book of Mormon becoming easier to disprove over time, maybe some people would take that argument. I'm sure they would. By the same token, I see scholars and academics who, when they study these data points and they study the relevant history and archaeology in the Americas, they actually see parallels and kind of bullseyes, if you will, that, like you said, Joseph Smith probably didn't know. And so we just kind of have to weigh whether or not they are conclusive or not, if just kind of the strength of the argument that they give. But I've been surprised at the way that the Book of Mormon, the society, the history, and the civilizations that it describes, in a lot of ways parallel what Latter-day Saint scholars have found within Mesoamerica. Personally, I'm of the camp that feels that out of all candidates for where the Book of Mormon took place, Mesoamerica is the strongest one. There's other Latter-day Saints who would disagree and say it took place in the Heartland or maybe Baja, Mexico, or California, I mean.
Meldrum and Jake Hilton. Shout out to the Heartland crowd.
Yeah. And so just for me, that's one of the points where I see the Book of Mormon being at least having substance enough to provide individuals the means to make these arguments that they then see parallels in actual history. So to me, that speaks to me on a few levels. I'm not saying that's completely conclusive on to whether or not it's valid, but I've just been surprised at the amount of discussion that's been able to be held. It's not an easy debate one way or the other, and I think there's a lot of information, a lot of arguments that can be put for and against it. I lean one way, obviously, but I've just been surprised by that. This isn't just a book that's been easily dismissed and set aside. Lots of volumes have been put forth on whether or not it's true, and there's good arguments on both sides. So, yeah, for me, that I just think that's very interesting.
Okay, well, that's good. I think there's a different way we can wrap up this discussion, and I'm not going to throw you a curveball, but open a discussion, and I'm not going to ask you any specific questions about history, etc. I think the listeners of the show can get a feeling that from the Book of Mormon discussion, if we start talking about the Book of Abraham or Joseph Smith or all of the different discussions, there's a lot of back and forth. He spoke about volumes and volumes about the Book of Mormon. The entire volume of apologetic material around Mormonism is massive. It really is.
Yeah.
Just as is the amount of critical materials against Mormonism.
Correct. Yeah. Now, so I think the best way to wrap up the discussion is actually to talk about apologetics then.
Okay.
And to talk about human psychology and to talk about competing apologetics. For instance, Jaxon, you've mentioned you've delved into Christian apologetics, and we all know of C.S. Lewis, and I've delved into Islamic apologetics and so on. And I think apologetics and a segue to a discussion about human psychology is probably more beneficial, and I'll explain why. All of us, none of us out of the three of us are experts, I assume, in any of the fields that analyze the Book of Mormon. So, for example, I don't specialize in DNA. I know there's a crowd of people here saying there's no DNA evidence, and a crowd of people here saying there doesn't have to be, or whatever happened, LDS.org essay. And then when it comes to archaeology, there's a crowd here saying something, crowd there. Most of the information we rely on is second, third, fourth hand. And I think we all recognize that. And so I think talking a little about how we analyze information and how we reason is also a key part of the picture. Now, that's not to say that apologetics has no merit. I actually think that anyone who's a Mormon who's seriously considering whether or not Mormonism is true, I'd encourage them to read apologetics. I think they have an important piece of the puzzle to contribute, right? I think it's important to consider all of the viewpoints when making a decision. And it's actually by reviewing apologetics myself that's how I lost my belief in Mormonism.
Really?
Yes, that's right. And
I've heard others have this too.
Yeah, and it actually wasn't. Some people will say, for example, in the CS letter, the difference between, say, Fair Mormon's worldview, if you want to call it that, the aggregate of all of their writers, and the traditional contemporary LDS view. In the CS letter, he highlights the difference between those. And I think anyone who's honest will say that there is a difference between the straightforward, clean-cut narrative of the LDS Church and the likes of Fair Mormon's reasoning. But actually, that didn't bother me per se. What bothered me ultimately was deep analysis of apologetic arguments, particularly finding double standards in how evidence is considered. So I actually have 2 or 3 articles on my blog, and I call it the mosaic of apologetics. It's not about any individual argument. I think if you had a challenge, say DNA or whatever particular issue it is, if you challenge one argument, you can come up with some kind of response that's sort of satisfactory. I think the bigger picture comes when you read a lot of apologetics and you look at the mosaic, you look at how the apologetic arguments work together, or whether or not they are coherent as a set together. And so my conclusion ultimately was that apologetics is sort of like a tangled web of what I call mental workarounds. Basically, issues are worked around in various ways, but the workarounds themselves don't cohere extremely well. So I wrote about that in an article, but I think this comes down to whatever truth there is someone to believe in it. There is an interpreter. So whatever objective reality there's a human in the picture trying to interpret that reality. And so when there's a human psychology is also part of the picture. In other words, how we reason, how we apply logic to different scenarios. And so I'd like to open just a brief discussion. I know I didn't, unfortunately, I didn't know that, we could segue into this, and let me know if you're comfortable with this. But I do actually have a quote that I'd like to give you, which sort of launches off in this discussion. So back in 1902 or something, the psychologist William James wrote a very classical book called The Varieties of Religious Experience. And I don't know if either of you've read it, but it's very, very good. And he has a quote here that says, "The truth is that in the metaphysical and religious sphere, articulate reasons are cogent for us only when our inarticulate feelings of reality have already been impressed in favor of the same conclusions. Then, indeed, our intuitions and our reason work together, and great world-ruling systems like that of the Buddhist or the Catholic philosophy may grow up." So this is the idea that our powers of reason are influenced by our feelings. As he says, articulate reasons are cogent, meaning logically persuasive for us, only when our inarticulate feelings of reality have already been impressed in favor of the same conclusion. So sort of my final question to the two of you is in this realm of so-called, you both have, I take it, some background in psychology. Some you've done reading about psychology. This is about the phenomenon of confirmation bias and motivated reasoning. There's a really good article online, which is ironically titled, "This Article Won't Change Your Mind." And it's all about the phenomenon of motivated reasoning. It just speaks about how we analyze evidence, how we look at certain arguments as enemies and certain arguments as friends, and when we analyze evidence. And so this is sort of my final question to you is, I mean, you've both delved in LDS apologetics and it seems also to an extent apologetics from other religions. When I look at LDS apologetics at length, and then I go look at Islamic apologetics and Christian apologetics and all sorts of different apologetics, I see every religion having its critics and its apologists. And when I analyze them, they all eventually start looking pretty much the same. And apologetics seems to be this phenomenon of motivated reasoning. It seems whatever argument, however remotely reasonable, can defend our point of view, we will make that argument. And so, as I said, the reason I lost my belief in the LDS Church was extensive analysis of apologetics, to the point where I started to see that the arguments don't cohere, that they themselves contradict each other, or that the treatment of evidence is not even-handed. So when a third or fourth hand account supports belief in Mormonism, it's right there on the fair Mormon side. But when a first-hand account contradicts it, when 7 first-hand accounts say Zelf, the skeleton, we're talking about Mesoamerica, right? When 7 or 8 first-hand accounts, or second-hand accounts watching Joseph Smith, all say almost exactly the same thing, that is dwelt on. So my conclusion is, I don't think apologetics deals with evidence in a fair, objective, balanced manner. And I think you can find that not just by looking at LDS apologetics, but by looking at others. You have to look at Islamic apologetics, as I said, Christian apologetics, etc. So what are your responses to this line of reasoning, this challenge?
Well, I'll just say a few things. I'm aware of this, and I agree with what you're saying. Just that naturally we have the potential for confirmation bias, and what was the term you used?
Motivated reasoning.
Motivated reasoning, yeah. That definitely makes sense. And I've heard before individuals in the church say regarding individuals who leave the church, oh, well, they left just because they wanted to leave, or
they wanted to sin, they're lazy, yeah.
Not even that too, but just like if an individual like yourself, let's say, dives into critical and apologetic materials and makes their conclusion that they need to leave, and that's what they conclude, people will be like, oh, well, that's just what they wanted to conclude in the first place. They started with that motivation. It goes both ways, right?
But and, to honestly say this, I speak for myself and many others who've left. Many of us wanted nothing more but the church to be true. Actually,
don't mistake me in saying that. I know you know that you're applying a double standard by any means. I was using that to show that Latter-day Saints themselves apply a double standard. Because by the same token, if an individual decides to stay, they're not going to say, well, you're staying just because you want to stay. So I will say we all suffer from the disease of confirmation bias and of wanting certain things, and our reasoning is impacted by that. And I'll be the first one to say that I'm guilty of this, and I've caught myself in many ways. I don't know a person who hasn't. You described sources that are deemed friendly or argumentative. I've entered conversations or debates where I have my blinders on, or I have my guard up, and several years ago, the first thing I would do is just be like, okay, there's a criticism. Well, let's see what Fair Mormon has to say, because they must be right. And once I would just read what they say, oh, okay, they have an answer. That answer then must be right, right? And I was comfortable with that, and that appeased me for the moment. That doesn't cut it anymore. I've had to change different perspectives that I have, because I see arguments for and against. Like I said, I'm still in the camp that leans in a faith promoting and sustaining area, and I'm not saying that I necessarily plan on leaving, but just I think each of us need to recognize our own limits and our own weaknesses in this sense, and just like I said, when we're dealing, just try and approach these things as objectively as possible. I mean, it's impossible because we're all coming to this as individuals with preconceived ideas and feelings, and they influence, our arguments and decisions. But we just need to be cognizant of that. We need to try and, avoid that whenever we can by looking at double standards on both sides. I will say that there are apologetic arguments made in defense of Mormonism that I wouldn't use myself, because I feel that they employ a double standard, and I hate when, people that I'm arguing against do the same thing. So, you just, you gotta take it both ways.
That's great. That's very honest. Thank you. Great. Any comments, Leo, from your side while we wrap up?
I have no confirmation bias.
Me neither. Isn't that great? Yeah, no,
it's all true.
Yeah,
it's all true. I know it is. No, I mean, that's guys. I hear you. Like, growing up in the church, I have no excuse. I mean, I just, I can't prove it to you guys or to anybody that I'm without confirmation bias for sure. So, I mean, I don't know. I just feel like if God is real and he loves everybody, he's going to try to get everybody to believe. And that's, remember the light of Christ, right, Shawn?
Yes,
we're all born.
Obviously, I remember this concept. Yeah.
So, yeah, right. So, I mean, I just feel like.
Sorry, you should explain that for our listeners. Like, what is the light of Christ?
So, I equate the light of Christ with grace of our Savior Jesus Christ, and it's this lifting power, beautiful power that encourages all people to be good. And I feel like, if I were to see a meta-analysis on all the different religions and their mutually exclusive, unique truth claims are being confirmed, and I could see that data, I'd be interested to see it. But maybe you've got something you can show me where we have, where it is, that. But even that, like, even if we were to have a meta-analysis that showed every religion, people are praying about their unique truth claims and are receiving answers, and even then, I feel like there would be a reason to believe that God wants people to believe in him and wants them to be good. And, after this life, when we're standing before or kneeling before our Maker, Jesus Christ, and he's looking down at us, and we look up at him and realize that, everybody's having that same opportunity to look up at him and plead our case before our advocate, and then he pleads with the Father on our behalf. I think it'll all become clear at that point, and hopefully the lights don't turn off, right? When we're gone, and hopefully we can, realize that we need to rely on our Savior. But I don't know. That's just kind of some of my thoughts there.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Leo.
To your point, again, firstly, if there's an afterlife, I'd like to meet Hathor. Hathor is the Egyptian goddess of, fertility. So, if there's an afterlife, I want to do a shout out to Hathor. I also want to meet Zeus and Thor. And a couple of other gods. That would be awesome. But on a less facetious note, you spoke about principles. And when I was going through my faith transition, something that I thought extensively about was exactly the question of principles. And briefly, if you took all of the religious worldviews and you put them together, you said meta-analysis, you'd find a wide variety of doctrines. Doctrines would vary extensively, but principles would be a lot more similar. The idea of the golden rule, do unto others as you want them to do to you, etc. So I think what we can agree with is that there is something, for me, I don't call that the light of Christ, but there is this desire in some of us, not in all humans, to be fair, to be good. And we have an innate sense of what goodness is. And I throw my, I'm on the side of, there's a really good book, Sam Harris, The Moral Landscape. And I'm on the side that goodness is that which leads to greater well-being for conscious creatures, beings capable of experiencing suffering or well-being. And so I think it's difficult to disagree with the idea that if anything is good, it's increased well-being for all of us. And so I think we're all kind of on the same page, at least on that front. To your point about death and the lights going off, Christopher Hitchens, again, I'm quoting all these big atheist figures. He makes this statement about that we will never overcome our tendency towards superstition until we overcome our fear of death. And so what I can say is I don't actually think there's an afterlife, but I'm not afraid of death. And there are reasons for that. And one of the main reasons is just like you weren't afraid to not be born because it was like nothing to not be born. So I'm not afraid of death because it's not like anything that we know of. That's more of a philosophical point of view. Mm-hmm. But anyway, let's wrap that up. I just want to thank both of you for coming on. I think this has been a great discussion. I think that you've both been very honest and very straightforward, and I really appreciate that. I feel like there's been a spirit of goodwill. Like I don't think any of us has had the desire to attack or to belittle each other. So I feel like that's gone extremely well. It's definitely definitely met my expectations. And just thank you both for your time. And I think we're all on our own journeys, as I mentioned in the beginning. We tend to think that we're at a destination, and then what we're actually in reality, the three of us are sort of like people on three different roads having a quick phone call and talking about which road we're on. And we haven't reached the destination yet. And that includes people like me who I don't think I'll ever believe in the LDS Church again. But when I look back at who I am today in 10 years' time, I'll probably say, oh, what a naive person. That's how we often are. Right? We often look back at ourselves 2, 3, 4, 5 years before, and we're frequently impressed with how naive we were, right? In all circumstances. So I think it's
I'll
important
make a trip down there, Shawn, to baptize you. Yeah,
that's all right.
5 years.
You don't need to. I'm actually still a member of the church. Like,
really?
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you for the stat.
Yeah, I might not be. If there's a rumor amongst ex-Mormons that there's this thing called the Strengthening the Church Committee. Have any of you heard of this?
I heard of that.
I'm not sure if it's real. I actually don't. I wonder to what extent this is just sort of
sensationalized
superstition. Yeah. But if my stake president, gives me a call after this interview or something, then we'll know that there might be a strengthening the youth. Was it strengthening the church committee?
Strengthening the youth.
but yes, But actually, I am on paper. I'm still a Mormon, but that's
Good.
Mainly because, well, it doesn't really. I mean, this might hurt you, but it doesn't really mean anything to me. It's more like a Twitter account that I created once and I don't use anymore.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, we all agree that it's really the personal spiritual journey that counts, not whether you're on some database in some data center in Salt Lake City.
Yeah.
So,
you
matter, Shawn. Don't worry about that.
you have an agenda.
I'm on that committee.
You should become my home teacher.
Yeah. I want to come down to Australia. I'm going to come down there and we're going to hang out and we're going to go to church. Okay.
Yeah, watch me get called on a mission down to Australia.
Yeah,
that would be funny. If you get sent to a Mandarin Chinese speaking mission in Sydney, Australia, then there's a 95% chance we'll bump into each other because I speak Mandarin, and when I do go to church, I go to the Chinese ward because I like practicing.
That's really neat.
Cool. All right. Thank you both. Really appreciate your time. And I'm ending the broadcast now. Thanks everyone to anyone who actually watched the whole interview. Good on you for that. Thanks so much.